And now for Chapter 3. This is the Hackables. Hackables are not the same as the Shearables. And by Hackables, I also sometimes call them Whackables. I use the terms interchangeably. Sometimes, and actually frequently, they are cut to a low framework or to the ground, and it is important to do this thing in the spring. There's different kinds of hard pruning, which means whacking something back quite severely. There's radical renovation, and I talk about this in some other slideshows, and that's done, about once every 15 years with shrubs that have been mal-pruned, or some hedges can be renovated when they've gotten too huge, and sometimes you can get a second life out of some of your shrubs. Then there are some plants that are what's called coppiced or stooled. Those are plants that you cut to the ground or to a low framework every year. And those examples of those plants are redtwig dogwoods, roses, and buddleias. And then what we're going to talk about today is the sub-shrubs, which is a strange little group of plants that's kind of halfway between a perennial and a shrub. And we'll go over the differences between them and the real shrubs. But as far as the hardy shrubs go, your hybrid roses are frequently cut in half every spring. It's pretty scary when you're a new gardener and you realize you're supposed to cut your hybrid rose almost to the ground every spring. It seems so unkind, but it works pretty good, and that's traditional pruning for your hybrid roses. Butterfly bushes can also be coppiced either low or high. You can cut them to 6 inches off the ground, or sometimes you can cut them off high up on a high framework. And also red twig dogwoods and yellow twig dogwoods, and sometimes the white brambles are cut hard every year, 2 inches from the ground. And you do that so that the new growth comes out and is brighter in color. And people ask me, when do I prune my red twig dogwood? And it actually would occur to you naturally, because we like to look at them in the winter. That's why we have them, is for those red twigs when all the leaves are off. So if you cut it down in, say, December, you wouldn't get to look at it in the winter. So you leave it to look at in the winter, and then you cut it down in the spring and let it grow all summer. And then it'll be 1 to 3 feet tall by the end of the year, at which point it will drop all its leaves and be pretty and red again. And there are others. Here's a couple of them. This is a rose and a fuchsia. Both of these can get cut hard. This is an example of your rose pruning, your hybrid rose pruning. You cut some of the canes to the ground. These are shown in black. And then you reduce what's left by about half the height of the shrub. Butterfly bush is also one of the plants that are sometimes coppiced, specifically Davidii. This is what a butterfly bush looks like. It looks sort of like a lilac, has this purple cone. They are invasive in some parts of the country, and they are now inventing ones with heavier seeds that don't go out and compete with the Scotch broom to take over the empty spaces and your garden. I'm sure they will be coming up with very well-behaved ones soon, so stay tuned and don't hate all the butterfly bushes. I'm sure there will be some well-behaved ones. If you have one and you're not ready to get rid of it, and you want to keep it, you could coppice it right after it was through blooming by cutting it to the ground. Looks like this. Pretty scary stuff. You cut it to the ground, or actually 4 inches above the ground. And the thing about this shrub is it will grow back 8 to 10 feet and bloom the next year. You could wait till spring to do this and cut it down to the ground. And it's just amazing. You do not have to do this. If it's an awful lot of work, unless you feel that you need to, you can just let it be like a small tree and let her rip. If you prune heavily, you will get a lot of growth, which is very floppy. Notice the butterfly bush branches that are kind of flopping over here. This was a butterfly bush that was headed very hard, which is to say coppiced. If you coppice your butterfly bush, it will be lower and broader and kind of floppy. If you let it grow taller, it will be stiffer and more upright and skinnier, but the blooms will be way up high. Here's one that's been pruned heavily, and you notice that some of the branches are pretty floppy on it. That's okay, it's not a big problem. Another way to prune them is to head them up high, and you can use that non-selective heading cut, which I told you you shouldn't use. Well, these are the exceptions. You shouldn't be shearing your shrubs, generally speaking. You shouldn't be hacking your shrubs, generally speaking. But this slideshow is of all the things that you do that too. So if you're confused, just remember these are the exceptions. And it's based on how the plants bloom and how they respond to heavy pruning. So this is coppicing up high. You can see where the cuts are made. This is what it looks like after it's been through cut. You can see the tops have just been cut off, and that's where the new growth will occur. So this is also proper pruning of a buddleia. Redtwig dogwood, a very tough shrub. This is what it looks like if it's cut to the ground every year or if it's a baby. Once it's become established in 2 or 3 years, you can start cutting all the canes to the ground every year or every other year or as the spirit moves you. If you do not cut them to the ground, only the tips will be red. So you can have a really huge, which is to say 8 to 10 foot shrub with just the tips are red, or you can have a moderately large, which is to say 4 to 5 foot shrub that's red from the tip to the ground if you cut it every year. It's a lot of work. But sometimes, especially if you live on a lot of land and the soil is pretty crummy, this is a good way to fill up a field with some pretty red twigs for the winter. Here's a yellow twig dogwood, same idea, except it's yellow. And this is what it looks like when you're through pruning it. You prune a little bit farther out every year. Something to know about pruning things hard, which is to say cutting them to the ground, is that you want to do it not when the cut's too big or too small, but just right. So you don't want to start hacking on your butterfly bush or your red twig the first year or two it's in, because it actually needs those branches to establish itself. But you don't want to wait till they're too huge, which is to say bigger around than your ankles. It has more of a chance of completely dying then. Not to say that we don't do that every once in a while because they're so tough. Frequently they do make it back, but ideally you want to prune these plants when they're no more than, say, 1 inch in diameter. And as I said before, the timing would occur to you if you were just paying attention. You want to do your red twigs in the spring or early summer, and you want to do your butterfly bushes in the winter or the spring so that they will grow back and have flowers by the end of the summer. There's a whole list of plants that could be coppiced, or we sometimes call it stooling. You do not have to do this, but sometimes people cut their forsythias to the ground every year. Timing's important then. You want to prune it right after it blooms, not right before, because if you pruned it right before it bloomed, it wouldn't. So you wait till it's through blooming and then cut everything down to a low framework. Sometimes people do this to smokebushes, paulownias, even eucalyptus. We do it with eucalyptus so we can get the juvenile foliage. Some of the willow shrubs can get cut to the ground, and even elderberry can be cut to sort of a low framework. And these plants can withstand this sort of treatment. Just because you can do it to them doesn't mean you can do it to everything. Once again, these are the exceptions to the rules. And now we're in an interesting category called the sub-shrubs. I remember when I first heard the term sub-shrub, I thought, oh my Lord, what next? But I finally have kind of figured out what that means. It means that you prune them sort of like a perennial, which means you whack them to the ground, but you also prune them kind of like a shrub, which is to say you don't do it in the fall, you do it in the spring. because if you do it in the fall, sometimes you kill them. And you want to wait till they're starting to grow in the spring before you whack them back. And here are some of the more common ones. Fuchsia, Cape Fuchsia. Fuchsia's on the horticultural spelling bee. Fuchsia. Just try to feature that. Fuchsia, it's along with mycorrhizae and Phytophthora will be on the spelling bee. Cape Fuchsias, perovskia, lavatera, and Senecio gray, or greyi. I call it greyi, as it is sometimes spelled. So they're woody, like a woody plant, not soft-wooded like a perennial, like a iris or a peony. So they're woody, so you do whack them hard, but unlike your iris, you don't cut it to the ground in the fall and the winter. You wait till the spring. Some of these you cut in half. You don't actually cut to the ground, but they definitely fall into the category of the hackables and the whackables. Hardy fuchsia. It's a very nice shrub. Blooms later in the summer, which is one of the reasons you can hack them, is they grow up and bloom in the same year. Here it is. It gives you something to look at a little bit later in the year when everything else is through blooming. That's nice. Here's a nice little fuchsia shrub. And just know that some of them get really quite tall. Some of them get to be, 5 or 6 feet tall. Some even taller than that. And yes, they can get quite enormous. Here's a whole yard full of them that they look like shrubs, not like perennials. And you don't need to do anything with them. If they're looking fine to you, you just leave them alone. But occasionally around here, they freeze to the ground. You'll know because all the leaves will fall off and they'll look dead. And the temptation is just to go out and whack them right away. But for some reason, we're not really sure. We actually like to leave the dead sticks on and wait till we start seeing the new growth come up from the ground, and then we whack it out. Here it is. You can see the dead sticks that we just cut down and see all that growth around it. That's the new growth emerging from the root system. And that's about how far you cut it back. And if for some reason you want to do this every year just because you like to prune, and you might be able to make some moderate size reduction difference in your fuchsia, you could conceivably do this whether or not it froze. And I just thought you should know that they can be cut in half, and some people even hedge them. Or you can leave them alone completely. I like that because it is the lowest maintenance. And personally, I hate fighting the size of plants. So if my plant's too big, I just dig it up and move it, and they're pretty good candidates for that. So you have lots of options with your hardy fuchsias. And here's another plant. It's not really a fuchsia. It's a Phygelius. And these came into being here in the Pacific Northwest within the last 10 years. And standard operating procedure is to cut them in half in the spring, not in the fall, just as the new growth is coming on. Why? Well, they really get too big and leggy. And it's not okay to do that with your shrub, but it's okay to do that with your sub-shrub. Here they are. They kind of look like a fuchsia. Hummingbirds love them. Tough as nails, come in pretty colors. They can be, kind of invasive. They will actually send out runners and start taking over parts of your garden. And you can just dig them up and give them to your enemies if you so choose. Here's some nice kind of yellowy ones. And here's one that we whacked back in the spring as parts of it have died. We just cut it, died back for the winter. We've cut it to a low framework or in about half in preparation for the next year. And here it is coming back, great gangbusters, looking good. So that's your Cape Fuchsia. Another mysterious plant is the lavatera, also known as the tree mallow. And it's a nice shrub. It's kind of a low-class shrub. Who makes these decisions? I don't know. This is what we think of them when we first plant them. They kind of remind you of a hollyhock. And I think they are a great filler shrub because they're tough as nails. They grow this tall in just 1 year. but they'll grow even bigger after that. And they get so tall and leggy that they start to crack under their own weight. So one of the standard operating procedure for these is to cut them to a low framework like this every spring. Pretty scary looking. As I said to you before, this is not what we do to most of our trees and shrubs. No, 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 that would be butchery. But we do it with these exceptional shrubs and sub-shrubs because they're special and they have special needs, and they're just sort of the masochists of the plant world. This is what it looks like when it's starting to grow back in the spring. Notice those great big stems that were cut low. And here again, if you wait for it to get too big and too woody, say a cut that's probably, say, 2 inches in size may not flush back out. It's the little ones, the ones that are an inch or less in diameter, that if you cut, they will regrow. So you don't want to wait till your shrub, or in this case your sub-shrub, is so old that when you whack it back, it dies. You want to let it grow for a few years and then start whacking it back to a low framework. And just know that these plants kind of just die out naturally on their own. They are not a long-lived plant. And therefore, I think they're great filler to fill in all those empty spaces in the landscapes, the new gardens that you've planted, because they are sort of an immediate gratification plant. They grow up really tall, really fast. They have these flowers that last all summer long. They're almost immortal in a vase, and they're pretty in pink. And just about the time that the homeowner catches on that they're not the coolest plants, they die. How useful. And this blue-purple plant is a perovskia, also called a Russian sage, and it's also kind of one of those sub-shrub thingamajigs. It has beautiful blue spike on it all summer long. Can look like this. Nice, I'm liking it. But in the winter, it dies back and it has these kind of silver stems. And the temptation is just to whack it back when you're whacking back all the other perennials, but don't do that because it might cause it to die. You have to wait till the spring when the new growth is coming up. See the new growth at the base? That's all this year's spring growth. Now we're going to go in and cut off all those. They sort of look like sparklers. And here it is coming up from the ground. It's going to do that every year. There you go. Specialty pruning. Senecio greyi. Of course, they're changing the names of everything. I'll always be Senecio to me. Looks like this. It's a wonderful sub-shrub. It's a different color. You know, we get kind of tired of green. Everything's green, green, green. It's nice to have some silver. This is a silver thing, and it's not too huge. Most things in our gardens are 8 to 10 feet tall and wide, so it's nice to have some lower story. And this makes a nice contrasting shrub. It does have a insignificant yellow flower that you can just shear off if you don't like the color. It's mainly there as a foliage plant. And what can I say about Senecio? It can also get kind of too big and rangy. And so traditionally, after it has become established, after it's been planted for 3 years or so, you can cut it in half. Don't cut it clear to the ground, but reduce it by about half with ugly non-selective heading cuts all over, and it will flush back out and be gray and nice. So those are the Hackables. We've done the Shearables. Those are the things you take your head shears out and gently shear them in the spring. You've done your Hackables, which you either cut to the ground or to a low framework, and the timing kind of depends. Most of it we do in the spring except for your yellow twigs, your red twigs, and your white twigs.